I'd like to welcome Brigid Wasson, who's spoken several times now. This time she's talking about Lassie Come Home, 5 steps shelters can take to increase dog reclaims. Thank you so much, Brigid.
Good morning, everybody. Are we getting a little tired? But it's been an amazing week, and we've got a great lineup today. So yesterday we focused on cats. Today we're going to talk about dogs. And the reason that dog reclaims are so important for us is because in pounds and shelters across Australia, the US, and presumably much of the world, a large percentage of our population in shelters are stray dogs. And if we don't find their owners, we are stuck with all these dogs that we're trying to rehome or send to rescue or having to euthanize. This is especially important in light of all that you have learned about animal behavior from our amazing veterinarians and behaviorists who've spoken also this week, to understand that sometimes if animals are not doing well in the shelter and they're not necessarily adoptable, that doesn't mean that they weren't doing fine in the home that they had. Because I've seen some dogs that were just absolutely, you couldn't touch them, couldn't get anywhere near them, but their owner comes up and they're wagging butt and they're fine. So we want to do all we can to keep those dogs in their loving homes where they belong and not have to have them sit at the shelter waiting for their owner. So this is me. So we'll get right to it. So why are those owner reclaim rates so low? We've got to figure that in Australia and the US, in populated, developed areas, truly feral dogs are really rare. They do exist in some parts of the country, some parts of the world. But in general, 99% of the dogs that are coming into your pounds and shelters are owned pets, especially those that are friendly and healthy. I can't tell you how many times someone has walked in and said, "Wow, look at that dog," pointing to some purebred. It has an owner that must be looking for it. Well, they all do. They didn't just pop up out of a hole in the ground. Someone owned this animal, whether it was 1 hour, 1 week, or 1 year ago, was the owner of this animal. So we want to ask ourselves, what are we doing wrong? How can we improve? Let's rethink our practices, because it's easy to say what other people should do, what owners should do, and we'll talk about that as well. But what can we do? How can we make this process better? So in order to understand what's happening today, we need to look at the past. I almost didn't share this graphic because it's so disturbing, but I decided that it was important to do so, to look at our history. And I've gotten a lot of the US history from the New York Times and the magazines that were around at that time, because they keep archives from back into the 1800s. Other than that, it's difficult to know what our history is. Many pounds and shelters have sort of recent records, but you go back generations or 50 or 100 years ago and nobody could tell you how things were done at the time. So this graphic here is, I believe it was actually from Harper's Weekly, and it shows a picture of a crying woman saying she can't reclaim her pet. And it shows the horrible fate of the dogs at the time, which was their version of euthanasia, was drowning. So these agencies came into existence largely in sort of mid to late 1800s, more on the east coast of the US because they were populated by Europeans earlier than we made it to the west coast. And their focus was on public safety. There was nothing about adoptions or anything like that, and neutering was probably not even heard of at the time. And it was all about dogs biting people, spreading diseases, and killing livestock. So in the cities, it was more about the public safety and attacking people, killing other dogs. And in the country, where many people at that time made their living from raising livestock, this was a real problem. If animals were killing your livestock, not only was this inhumane, that was also your income for the year. So this is how these agencies came about. They were strictly animal management. There was nothing about the practices that we have today. However, it's kind of an interesting dual history. The Societies for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals came about kind of at the same time. You'll look at like the ASPCA, San Francisco SPCA, all their start dates are somewhere around 1880, 1890. All of these agencies kind of came into existence at the same time, but doing different things. So you have the management and the public safety, and then you have the SPCA, the Humane Society, whatever you want to call it. And I believe this is the logo for San Francisco. Their focus was on the issues of the day, which a lot of it had to do with working animals like horses, that at that time your horse could drop dead in the street and there was no follow-up for the owner. There were no laws saying that you could not treat an animal cruelly or put it to death. And then the abolishment of vivisection, which was coming about at the time, which was experimentation, medical experimentation on animals. So these were the new issues of the day that people were really focusing on for animal cruelty. And I have a subscription to the New York Times because it's interesting even today, but it also gives me access to their archives, which go all the way back to the 1850s, which is amazing. So I've been doing some research. I'd like to do some really in-depth research, and I may contact someone at the Times to do so, because it's difficult for me to translate some of what was written at the time, because in those days people spoke differently, and I'm not really getting some of the subtleties, but I'm getting the idea of what was happening at the time with dogs. So this is a little snippet that I took out of probably one of the old microfilms that's now on the internet. And this is, as far as I can find, the first inkling in America of something having to do with owner reunions and adoptions. This is the first mention of something about adoptions. So at the time, it was basically a bounty system. Dogs were running around in the street at large, and anyone could capture them and bring them down to the pound, and they would be given, I believe it was 50 cents. So it was a bounty system. Dogs were being not only picked up off the street, but stolen from people's yards. It became a money-making venture. It was just horrific and bizarre. So the ASPCA at the time said, okay, we need to start controlling the population, but there's got to be a better way. This is quite cruel. All of the dogs are being put to death, and people's pets are being snatched away from them. There's no incentive for anyone to try to keep the pets with their owners. The whole system is based on making money off of picking them up off the street. So they established one of the first hold periods, which was 48 hours, because at the time it was legal to shoot the dogs in the street where they were, or the hold period was until sundown. So that was all you got, was by the end of the day to come and get your dog. So they established a hold period of 48 hours and a redemption fee of $3. This was in the 1800s. I did the math. It was something like maybe 80 or 100 American dollars in today's world. So it's still a chunk of money, especially if you're a low-income person. And this quote here, the intention to provide for all good dogs and cats that are not redeemed with homes among people who can be depended on to be kind to them. So they don't use the word adoption, but that's what they're talking about. And that's the first time it's ever mentioned. So although these agencies, and I'm sure others across the world, tried to have a more humane world for dogs, still, for the last 100 years, we've been euthanizing most of the dogs. Historically, before maybe the 60s or 70s, we were euthanizing in the U.S. over 100 dogs per 1,000 people, compared to fewer than 12 per 1,000 today. So even though their hearts were in the right places, they really weren't doing a whole lot better than the old bounty system. And then as human populations increased, there were more conflicts with dogs. When people lived on hundreds of acres, you probably never even saw your neighbors, let alone worried about their dog. When people start moving into cities and towns, suddenly your pets become a nuisance. They're barking. They're going around at night trying to mate with other dogs. They're fighting. They're making noise. They're urinating and defecating in front of your house. So dogs started to become more of an issue. It was less of a concern of safety or of killing livestock, but now of simply being a nuisance to people. And on the good side, folks started now viewing dogs as pets, so they shouldn't be left outside. They shouldn't be roaming. And just like with the cats, now we started taking dogs in saying, well, they can't be in the street. They have to be in a home. So we need to take them down to the pound, and they're in need of rescue. So this is just kind of a paradigm change, changing with the way that people have lived in the last 100+ years. Now, thankfully, today we're doing a much better job, but even over 100 years later, we are still flooded with stray dogs. Every day, every pound across the U.S. and across Australia. Dogs, dogs, dogs. That's all we ever hear. Stray dogs being picked up. We can't find their owners. It's very frustrating. Rates are twice as good in Australia as they are in the US, but it's still less than half of those dogs. The other half, where are the owners? They didn't disappear. We're just not doing all we can to find them, or they don't know how to find us. So it's important to understand that many practices are based on assumptions. And that's what kind of gets us thinking. We've talked earlier this week about cognitive dissonance, cognitive bias, how we take in information, how we process information. Very important, because we want to rethink our practices, and we also want to rethink our reactions to things that happen and to things that people say to us. For example, an owner comes in to reclaim. They don't have enough money to pay the fee. They leave and they never come back. What are you going to assume? They don't care, right? They're irresponsible. But that's often not the case. If they don't have the money, sometimes they simply don't have it. Or they feel shamed. So they're not going to come back and say, I'm not working, or I'm on some kind of social assistance, and I don't want to have to provide that to you because this is embarrassing. This is something personal for me that I'm going through in my life. Or I have 5 children. Yes, they're a higher priority than my dog, so I have to spend money on them and not the dog. So we need to start thinking about what are the real reasons? Why are we just assuming that these things are happening? So let's examine some of these assumptions. Stray dogs are unwanted and abandoned. Okay, so as we said, the majority of dogs are owned or were owned by someone in the fairly recent past. When we see a dog that comes in and looks bad, what do we say? Oh my God, this dog has been neglected. He must live outside. He must be tied up outside all the time. Okay, there was a dog in Santa Clara County, California, where I used to live, named Sharky. It was a little Chihuahua dachshund. We call them Chiweenies, very common in that area. So Sharky lived with another dog with his owner's home. He was a beloved pet, adopted from a shelter, desexed, vaccinated, microchipped, the whole bit. Well, unfortunately, a lot of people prey on people's homes around Christmas time because they know there are presents and things to steal. So 2 burglars broke into the home, stole all the presents. It was all over the news. They called him the Grinch that stole Christmas and the missing dog. So Sharky got a lot of press as well. So they came in, stole all the family's gifts from under the tree. One of the dogs went and hid in the back of the house. Sharky bolted out the door, terrified. Weeks went by. We were trying to help the owners find the dog, but there were no sightings, not one sighting, and this was in the newspaper. The problem was they lived in kind of a wooded area, so we didn't know, was the dog lost in the woods? Was he dead? Was he taken in by another person? It was at least a week later, maybe 2, that I got a call from the owner, ecstatic that Sharky had returned. The other dog one day went to the door and started whining and getting excited. They opened the door. Who's standing there? Sharky. Where he was all those days, they didn't know. But he was skinny. He had injuries. He was dirty, covered in ticks, parasites, because this is a wooded area where they're very common. Now, if that dog came into your shelter, what would you have thought? This is a neglected dog. He's skinny, he's in poor condition, he's covered in parasites, when this was really a loved pet who went missing through no fault of his own or of the owners because of a robbery of their home. So we make assumptions about people being irresponsible. This is something that I've heard a lot about this week, and I'm glad that this is being addressed. That's not to say that there aren't people who are irresponsible. There most certainly are. In fact, one of my own neighbors at home, their dog is out every day. And every time I'm checking Facebook, look, here's a black lab. Does anybody know who this dog is? Yeah, it belongs to my neighbor. Yes, I get it. Some people are not doing all they can to confine their pet. But let's just assume that the majority of people are doing their best, really do care about their dogs, and are trying to keep them on their property. One of the things that can make the situation really complicated is that dogs can travel really far from home. And we've had some dogs, think of like a young male intact husky or something like that, that's very energetic, very motivated to travel. So unlike cats, who are generally found within a few houses, maybe a block of home, the dogs can be many kilometers away. Either they've gone there on their own feet, or someone has picked them up. And we've had cases where someone has tried to take the dog to a pound or shelter or take them home, and then they jump out of their car. And so now they're lost in some other area. So this just compounds the difficulty in figuring out where the dog lives and in the owner knowing where to go. Because let's say they live here, but then the dog ends up somewhere else. Which pound are they going to be at? How do they know? And as we've discussed earlier this week, there are many, many barriers to reclaim, to owners not knowing about the pound system, having poor timing, not having transportation, not having money. The list is endless of barriers. So let's start from the point that owners are good and want their pets back. Let's do all we can until either we don't find them or maybe they come forward and prove otherwise. Charging reclaim fees will make owners more responsible. So that's another fallacy that we deal with. So first of all, they're not getting charged the fee until after their dog has been picked up. So a series of things have already happened. The dog has already gotten out one way or another. It's ended up at the pound. They're there, so they've figured out where the dog is, and they want to reclaim it. So all of these stars have already aligned, and now they're there, and they're told, well, that's going to be $200. So punishing someone at that point is really not going to help. And again, I'm not talking about the person whose dog gets out every day. And there are also other options for that. For example, in Santa Cruz, California, they had a program. I know you had one of their folks here speaking possibly at the last conference talking about this. There was a program to help people keep their dogs confined because they did the math and figured out it was cheaper to buy them a dog kennel than it was to keep picking up the dog and returning it, or ultimately ending up having to put it up for adoption. So they were buying these modular kennels that cost maybe $200 and were just giving them to people. So they were getting grants and some sort of support to do that. So obviously there was funding needed for that type of a program, but it started with the difference in thinking. How can we help people? How can we make this stop happening? Because if someone doesn't have an adequate situation, maybe they're renting, so the landlord won't allow them to make changes. Maybe they don't have the money to do so. You know, home improvements are not cheap. So we should be thinking of all the possibilities, everything that we can do. I mean, ultimately, the owner does have to take responsibility. But let's do all that we can that is in our power to make it easy for people. So how's that working for us? Okay, not very well, as we've discussed. 20% in the US, a little over 40% in Australia. More than half of those dogs that are coming in not being found. Clogging up the kennels, clogging up the system, costing millions in taxpayer dollars. Ultimately being euthanized or housed for long periods of time to try to find an adopter, sent to rescue groups, and etc., when they could have just been sent home within a few days. Because without proactive programs, nothing is ever going to change. It's just the definition of insanity. You're going to do the same thing over and over and try to do more adoptions, and you're never going to adopt your way out of this problem because there will always be a sea of dogs coming in. But what if we could improve this even by 10%, even 1%? Across the country, that's thousands of dogs. So that's what I try to impress upon folks is don't be overwhelmed and think everything has to change. It doesn't work that way. Think of one thing that you can do, and I've heard a lot of good ideas from folks this week, that you can do to start making these changes in your organization. It's about percentages of improvement. Nothing is ever working 100%. Fewer shelters, at least that I'm aware of, are adopting out more than 50% of the dogs. So the live release rate is up by sending them to rescue, transferring them to other agencies, etc. But the actual taking in of strays, not a lot of them are getting adopted. And overburdened staff don't have time to be proactive. We know this. When we're totally stressed out and every day is spent processing intake, cleaning cages, trying to take care, the physical care of these animals, hundreds, thousands of them, We are overwhelmed. Nobody has time to sit there and talk to someone for 10 or 15 minutes and find out, well, where did you find this dog? Have you seen the owner? Do you maybe know who it is? But you'd be amazed when you start doing that, what people will tell you. I have seen folks in shelters when they start, normally you just do where did you find the dog? What's your name? Do the entry. But then when they take a little time, the person's not going to offer any information. They just go, here you go, here's the dog. Well, have you seen this dog before? Yeah, it's my neighbor's dog. He gets out all the time. Okay. Do you have your neighbor's address or phone number? Can we contact them? Have you brought the dog here before? Okay. Now you have information. You're having a conversation with the person. You can pursue it. Call that person. Say, what's the problem? How come your dog keeps getting out? Come on down and get him, and let's help you solve this problem. But shelters that implement even 1 or 2 best practices are seeing improvements, and that's what I talked about. It's not about fixing everything overnight in one day or even in 1 year, but just trying something. Try something new. I was working with one shelter where the staff were kind of being resistant about some things and saying, oh, we can't do that because whatever, A, B, and C. And it was actually the captain of their animal management team who stood up and said, let's try it. Try it for 30 days. Try it for 60 days. We don't like it, we go back to the old way, or we try something else. It was amazingly simple. Just try, see how it works. Nothing is set in stone. You don't have to do it that way forever. And not only will you see the reclaim rates increasing, but you'll see your intake decrease. Does anybody here want more animals in their shelter? Okay, I'm not seeing a lot of hands. Lower intake. We're able to spend more time with the animals who do need homes. We're able to help people more. We want them to get home and stay home. That's the name of this conference. That's what we want. Okay, so let's get to the steps. Rohnert Park. I love talking about them. They're a shelter in my area. There are many others that are doing good work, but I just happen to know these folks personally. The steps that they have taken have caused them to increase their reclaim rates to 40%, which, as I said, is double the national average in America. And it's through these proactive programs. They always give out a microchip and tag at the time of reclaim if they don't already have it. And they do a lot of proactive owner outreach. So in fairness, they cover 2 cities. So it's not a huge area. It is easier for them. But if they weren't doing all that proactive research, the previous management of the shelter in many years past did not do a great job, and they didn't have those rates. So it didn't happen automatically. It happened because of their proactive practices. Step 1 is think lost, not stray. And that is our slogan at Missing Pet Partnership, because it's about a paradigm change. It's about thinking differently. Okay, because we all have biases. We like to think that we don't. We like to think that, I'm educated, I know this, I'm open-minded, but we all make decisions every day based on our biases that have to do with our upbringing, our experiences, and everything else. So it's important to be aware of that, or to examine when you have a knee-jerk reaction. When someone suggests something and you're like, I don't want to hear that. Well, why? What's the problem? Examine it, question it. So these are some of the common ones. A dog looks unwell. It's been neglected. A fearful dog has been abused. We know now, the studies are showing that a lot of this stuff is genetic. A lot of these animals are born with the propensity to be outgoing or fearful. That's not to say that their environment doesn't affect that. It most certainly does, their upbringing and training and so forth. But a lot of animals that are really skittish are born that way, and there's not a whole lot you can do to change it. A dog that hasn't been seen before has been abandoned. I just saw this dog out by the side of the road. He must have been dumped. We had a dog in the Central Valley, California, named Bessie, was a Queensland heeler. When someone described the breed to me, they were surprised to find out that they're extremely common in California. We have tons of them. They're very popular. Not the greatest pets. I love them, don't get me wrong. I was just pet sitting for 5 of them before I came here. That was a noisy bunch. But this dog was traveling with her owner, and they were in a car accident that killed the owner. The owner died, and Bessie was thrown from the vehicle. So now it was the owner's family, next of kin, trying to, get over their grief of losing their family member, but now saying, wait a minute, where's the dog? So some of our people in the area helped to search, and unfortunately, ultimately, she was found dead. We think she was shot by a rancher because she was out with their livestock. But these are the kinds of times, it's so often when people say that dog was alongside the road, they must have dumped it there. But we have no idea what has really happened. And unfortunately, these kinds of things are common. They're involved in car accidents. They fall from vehicles, or they jump from vehicles just because they're dogs and they don't know. They don't know they're not supposed to do that. They see a squirrel and away they go. So we can never make assumptions unless we are 100% certain that that is what has happened. Because words have power. Think of bullying. Think of discrimination. Words become thought, and thought becomes action. And if we believe that people are irresponsible, if we believe that their dogs are abandoned, dumped, abused, are we going to spend a lot of time trying to find those owners? Are we going to be respectful to them when they come down to the shelter? Probably not. But if you're thinking lost, okay, I'm going to start with the assumption that the owner's good and wants their dog back. You're going to make every effort to find that person. And sometimes it's just one extra thing. We had, it was a cat that came into a shelter in Sonoma County that was injured in a random accident by a bird fountain falling on the cat. And so the veterinarian who was treating the cat happened to live in that area and said, well, I'm going to go and hang up a flyer. So he treated the cat survived, just posted a little flyer in that area, and sure enough, a few days later, the owner called, came down and got the cat. But they would never have checked at the pound, which was quite a distance away from where they lived, if they hadn't seen that flyer. So it was that outreach that got them to come down and pick up their pet, who recovered and was taken home, thanks to the veterinarian. Step 2. Same thing for cats, but it's actually more important for dogs, posting online, because dogs tend to travel more, whereas cats are quite often hidden close to home. And while you certainly don't want to rely on the internet, or you don't want owners to rely on the internet, it is a better tool for reuniting dogs. So there's this great thing called the internet. You've probably heard of it, but if we're not using it, it's not going to help you. And I still see a lot of agencies not posting pictures or waiting a couple days, just not making this a priority. And I don't understand why, because it literally takes minutes. You click, boom, you're done. Doesn't have to be the greatest picture. It's not the pretty adoption picture. You just want to see the animal, see the face, see the colors, have some kind of listing of where the animal was picked up, whether the city, the street, something that's going to draw that owner in to come and look. Because we know most people, now there are a subset of people who don't use the internet, often elderly people, very low income people, maybe people who don't speak English. You need to have other ways of reaching them. But let's face it, 90% of people start their search for anything, whether it's lunch or what you're going to do while you're touring Australia. You're going to look for that on a mobile device, on a computer. So that information has to be accessible to people, or you're going to miss a lot of people coming down and looking. When you say, where are these owners? Why aren't they coming down? Well, maybe they can't find you. Maybe they know you exist, but they don't have any idea that you pick up stray animals, or that their particular dog could actually be there waiting at this very moment for them to come and pick them up. So these are some of the myths that are out there, that posting dogs encourages theft. And some people just will not, you can't argue with them about this. But my opinion is, if people can walk into your pound and steal dogs and walk out the door, you have a security problem. That's not an internet problem. That's a security problem. So, or if people are having such a hard time getting customer service, then maybe you need to work on that, if someone feels that they have to just take matters into their own hands. So this is an example of a page that we like. This is for Santa Clara County. There are a million others out there. I just happen to use this as an example that has a specific page for missing pets. And they have a one-click link to the lost dogs and the lost cats. It actually kind of should be found dogs and found cats, because they're the ones in the shelter, but that's what it means. So it's easy for folks. They can go right there, take a look. And I only was able to do a screenshot of that piece, but if you scroll down on the page, you'll see that and I think I have the link in your handouts, it will show you all the other agencies in the area, because the jurisdiction system in that area, and I'm sure in many, is super confusing. If your dog is in front of your house, you're in one city. If it goes down the street, it's in another city. If it goes the other way, it's the jurisdiction of another pound. So it can be very confusing for people. At least this gives them a list of places to call. That's my little bad dog, Kipper. He's posing for the picture. A lot of people say, we don't have time. We don't have time to take pictures. Okay, and we don't have time is one of those things that I don't ever want to hear. It's like, that's the way we've always done it. It's just, I get it. We're very busy. But these things must be done every time. It's like saying we don't have time to vaccinate. And that's scary, because the pounds and shelters that do that are surprised when year after year they have disease outbreaks, because they're not vaccinating upon intake. And maybe they wait a couple days, or maybe they forget and they never get to it. There was a shelter in my area that had a parvo outbreak, which is shocking, because this is like a developed high-income area. This should not be happening. But somehow dogs were getting all the way to adoptions without having ever been vaccinated, because maybe person A didn't do it because it was too late or something. Person B never got around to it. I don't know. There was just a breakdown in the system where those things weren't happening. So there has to be some intake protocol, and it has to happen every time, unless there is, a really extreme circumstance, as if the animal is extremely aggressive. Okay, so here's an example of a post. And if your intake is high, we recommend that you do an example each day. If you take in 30 dogs, you're not going to post 30 times, but put one picture with a link so people are aware. Because many Facebook pages I find, and Twitter, and your website has lots of adoption content. Looks great, but there's nothing about stray dogs. And how else will people know? They may know that the shelter's there and that you have pets for adoption or whatever, but they don't know that's where I need to go and look for my missing dog. Step 3 is educating your public. The reason this is important is because missing your pet is like being in a car accident. It's something that happens suddenly. You're not expecting it. And suddenly you're having to deal with all sorts of things that you never dealt with before. In the case of the car accident, you have, how are you going to drive home? How are you going to deal with your insurance company? Now you're dealing with this other person. Maybe their vehicle's damaged. Suddenly you have all these problems. How are you going to get to work tomorrow? It's no different with a missing pet. And people are not prepared for it. It's not something you can plan for. And this combination of problems, it's like a trifecta of failure. People don't have the knowledge that they need. They don't get the support from their peers, from their friends and family, who just say, oh, just get another one. Or he'll come back. People say that too, like magic. They're just going to reappear. And bad advice from people. It just works one on top of the other to decrease their chances of being reunited with their pet. So, for example, some dog behaviors, which we discussed at length in an earlier presentation about the behavior, is that dogs can become very fearful when they're out at large. So there's always an assumption. What do people want to do? Here, boy, here, boy, here, boy. They want to shout, clap their hands, chase the dog, and they're surprised when the dog runs away from them. Now, there are outgoing dogs who will run right up to people, but many of them will not. And especially if they're being chased by multiple people who mean well but are just trying to get their hands on them, often they end up just chasing them out into traffic or out into the woods where they go hide. And now the situation's even worse than it was before. Okay, we recommend that you give out ID with every reclaim. Does anybody do this? Excellent. Microchipping, ID tags, there's no reason to not give those away. The tags cost pennies. The machines are not cheap. I understand that part. But some kind of ID, there's even ones you can write, little temporary ones, just something that's on the dog and the chip, so that when they leave your facility, if they get out again tomorrow, which they might, now whoever finds them in the community can find the owner, or the veterinarian can find the owner. They don't have to keep coming back to you every week without any kind of ID on. And the collars can be donated. So these are good items for donors or your friends group to purchase for you. And as well with the microchips. With shelters, there's a lot of competition. The downside is that there's a lot of chip companies and registries, but the good side is that there's more competition and the prices are lower today. So the final step is engaging volunteers to help owners find their missing dogs. And the reason for this is that people need support. As we've mentioned, they're not getting it from friends and family. They don't know what to do. Just a little counseling from someone in your agency could mean the difference to them finding their pet and their dog either not coming to the shelter, or if it does, them getting it back quickly. Our goal is to have teams of missing pet consultants in every community, everywhere. That's a perfect world. In the US, I try to at least have some in each state. And the reason for that is that you understand your region. You know what the laws are. You know the demographics. You know the terrain. The desert versus the forest are different places to look. The pets are going to behave differently. So these folks can counsel people in your shelters when they come in, over the phone when they call, instead of just saying, yeah, come on down and fill out a loss report. If they could just spend 5 minutes saying, you know, this is probably what happened with your pet. Look at these things. Look at the Missing Pet Partnership website. Go on your website if you have some tips. Engage them just for a few minutes. And we found that people are more likely to find their pet and also to appreciate it. So these are called 5+5+55 posters. And what it means is 5 words or less that you can read in 5 seconds while driving 55 miles an hour. So basically you're driving down the road, you go like this, you can see it easily. You'll see lost pet flyers. I saw one yesterday. Actually, it was pretty good. It was a big banner with a picture. But often they're so little, you can't read the writing, you can't see the phone number. This is something that you can counsel owners to do, and if possible, if you can work with a printing agency to mass produce a number of the blanks for you, you can at least hand one out at the time and say, just put your information in the middle, but the lost dog, you know, the big bright color is there. It's really going to draw people's attention. These are extremely successful in generating leads for people, because ultimately they have to find their pet. But if they're getting calls, hey, I've seen a blue cattle dog in this area. Maybe you should come and have a look. And this is it's also keeping people encouraged so that they don't give up. They can also give tours in the shelters or assist them in filling out their lost reports. Because again, people are grieving, they're confused. Just having that human touch really makes a difference for people. And that's the end of it. Thank you.